I'm Daniel Moore, and this presentation is on Ruby in the browser using HotRuby, the virtual machine, to run Ruby on all browsers, basically. So, as you can see, we've got some Ruby code here, and we're calling jQuery. Actually, first, let me ask, how many of you do web programming of some kind, or have a little bit? Okay, most of you. And how many of you have some experience with JavaScript? Most of you. Okay, and the JavaScript framework like Prototype or jQuery? Okay, and I assume everyone has at least a little experience with Ruby. So I get the HotRuby virtual machine is a it's a virtual machine written in JavaScript that interprets Ruby bytecode. So this code here, when I click run, gets sent to the server, compiled into Ruby 1.9 bytecode, converted to JSON, and sent back to execute on the VM in the browser. And ideally, you'd be able to have this embedded in your page before, like pre-compiled as a step right before deployment, where you could have the Ruby bytecode in the browser, and so then it would just run on the page the same way regular JavaScript runs. So you can see I've got a hash here for the color to be blue, for like the CSS. So this is calling jQuery h1 and appending an exclamation point, but I don't think it goes over quite that far. So there, see, added it on. And setting the CSS to whatever this CSS is. Broke it. Because I gotta have correct syntax. Alright. So, you can also do things that are a little more interesting than just changing the CSS and setting the text. And so you'll notice this helper method here is how I call jQuery. This global native object is a reference to the window object in the browser. And jQuery is a function inside the window. So this helper method just defines J as a shortcut and passes all the arguments to the jQuery method. So when I call J over here, it's sending h1 to the jQuery method and returning the jQuery object for all h1 tags. So here it also works with blocks. And this is calling the native window alert method. Oh, and you can use Ruby syntax, so you don't need all your parentheses. So there it says what was bound at the event. And any questions so far? Nothing, huh? Speechless silence. So if I get, probably need a small this window. Okay, so if we get Firebug, You can see here it sends the source to the server and gets back as a response this massive looking bytecode type stuff. And these all are interpreted by the virtual machine and implement most of the Ruby language. So it's still missing a few things and there are a few bugs. As some of you may have known, HotRuby was originally started about 2 years ago, and there's some benchmarks saying it was pretty fast when compiled in Flash with ActionScript, or at least faster than Ruby 1.8, but it's certainly, or I haven't done any benchmarks lately, but it's probably not as fast as Ruby 1.9, and definitely not as fast as any actual native code that's not sort of string JSON bytecode. So this has to be interpreted by the VM, so it'll be a little heavier and a little slower, and even a little heavier and slower than native JavaScript if you were to code roughly the same functions. But as browsers are getting a lot faster and a lot more powerful with like Google Chrome and V8 and the new Firefox, I think they've got SunSpider or something, or maybe that's Safari, but also IE8, all the browsers are having faster JavaScript implementations, so it won't be as big a deal if it's got a little bit of extra overhead, if it can make your code a lot cleaner and a lot easier to use. Because I don't know how many of you have used JavaScript for a lot of bigger projects, but if you're not really diligent, it can be pretty tricky to code JavaScript, and it's not quite as fun as Ruby. Does anyone have any suggestions or want to try? See if something can execute? Just the result box. Oh, so if you were to use like a put statement. Yeah, it's just kind of, yep.
What happens if you do
There you
fork?
Probably wouldn't make sense in the JavaScript environment, but so yeah, I don't think the kernel methods are implemented, or at least many of the ones that, yeah. Yes.
So, does it need Flash? Like, for an example like this, is it using ActionScript and Flash?
It's not using Flash.
So it's not like a hard requirement.
Yeah, it's mainly because the VM is entirely in JavaScript. You can use it in Flash, and you can use it in a browser implementation of JavaScript. So this example here has no Flash, and also you don't even need to post anything to the server. It's just to get this interactive console. Since I don't have a Ruby compiler in the browser, I have to post to the server to compile it. But if you actually had the bytecode embedded on your page to begin with, then it wouldn't need to make an extra trip and could begin executing. This would work in IE6, Firefox, Safari, any browser that has a standard JavaScript implementation. Okay, and I guess I'll...
How big is the VM on the JavaScript?
It's actually only about 1,500 lines, including some of the built-in classes and methods, but it's not a full Ruby implementation right now. It only has like the most common methods. So I think a lot of the array and hash methods, some of the more esoteric ones are missing, some of the string methods are missing, but the basic methods are all there.
How much of JavaScript have you mapped over to Ruby, like some of the more JavaScript specific stuff, like
For that, I just use jQuery, and since you can tie into, let's see if I can, source, okay. So I can just write this really thin wrapper to jQuery, and so jQuery has a full native DOM interface. So because Ruby was never built as a browser language, it doesn't really have any DOM modules, except maybe, I guess, hprocot for CSS parsing. But none of that has really been designed to work in the browser the same way jQuery has. And jQuery has a nice sort of chainable Ruby-style syntax. So it fits pretty nicely into exactly the hole that the Ruby implementation has. And so we can just natively call jQuery and get all the native speed advantages of jQuery, and the cross-browser compatibility also. So it just takes care of a whole range of problems just by plugging it in and calling native jQuery. Oh, and if you go to this URL, app.strd6.com/compile, you can also try this out on your own machine. The source is on GitHub. Let's see if I can find it. And I forked it from someone else who imported it from Google Code about 6 months or a year ago. So it hasn't really changed too much. I updated it to Ruby 1.9.1 because originally it was compiling in 1.90. And in doing so, I introduced a couple bugs, but I also added a few other pieces of functionality. So I'd really like to see with this project is eventually to have a very full, very robust Ruby implementation, maybe using like Ruby spec or mspec once it's actually robust enough to host the specs itself, and get a more full implementation. And also a Rails plugin so that you can type script language equals Ruby, and then as part of your deployment, it would automatically compile it to native JavaScript. So then on your app, you wouldn't have to learn 2 languages. Okay, thank you.